Welcome to this webinar on pension scheme governance. My name is Liz Story and I'm an Audit Director in RSM's London office. During this webinar, I will look at certain aspects of pension scheme governance and suggest some actions that trustees and their advisors might consider taking in preparation for compliance with the new combined code from the Pensions Regulator. In particular, looking at those areas concerned with ensuring that there is an effective system of governance in place. The regulator's combined code was published for consultation in early 2021. The regulator received over 10,000 answers to its 260 questions in the consultation document and is now working through those responses. The combined code is expected to be laid before Parliament in the spring of 2022 and to become effective in the summer of 2022. One thing that is certain is that any amendments to the draft combined code following that consultation are unlikely to change the fundamental message underlying the original document, which is that the trustees are required to ensure that they have in place an effective system of governance, or ESOG. That's because the combined code derives from a statutory instrument, SI 2018-1103, namely the Occupational Pension Schemes Governance Amendment Regulations 2018, otherwise known as the 2018 Governance Regulations. The combined code is designed to assist trustees in meeting their obligations under this Pensions Act legislation. The SI amends the 2004 Pensions Act by replacing the requirement to have a system of internal controls with a requirement to have an effective system of governance including internal controls, or ESOG. This must be proportionate to the size, nature, scale and complexity of the activities of the scheme. So what is an ESOG? To understand this, let's take a look at the legislation, as that takes us back to first principles, and it's the SI that sets out what the Code of Practice must cover. The statutory instrument requires the ESOG to cover the following areas: how the ESOG provides for sound and prudent management of activities, and how it includes an adequate and transparent organisational structure with a clear allocation and appropriate segregation of responsibilities, how it includes an effective system for ensuring transmission of information, and how the ESOG includes an effective internal control system, how it ensures continuity and regularity in the performance of activities, including the development of contingency plans, and how it includes consideration of ESG factors related to investment assets within its investment decisions, and finally, how the ESOG itself is subject to regular internal review. The Code of Practice also covers certain other statutory instrument requirements. This includes the outsourcing of activities and the requirement to have written policies in place, for example in relation to the ESOG and the key functions of the pension scheme. There needs to be prior approval of those written policies by the scheme's trustees or managers, and then those policies need to be reviewed at least every 3 years. This is combined with the need to have remuneration policies in place and the requirement to perform an own risk assessment, or ORA. So the question that many trustees and pension managers will be asking is, so who does all of this apply to? The statutory instrument says that all schemes, regardless of size, must have an effective system of governance. For those schemes with 99 members or fewer, this means the list on this slide. For all other schemes with 100 members or more, all of the other requirements apply. So all trustees are going to have some work to do. What's not currently clear, however, is the extent to which in practice it's going to be possible to meet the requirements of the Act in a manner which is proportionate to the size, nature, scale and complexity of the activities of the scheme. This is certainly something that RSM has requested clarity over in sending our own response to the consultation document. Otherwise, I think there's a danger that the response to the Code of Practice simply becomes a box-ticking exercise to pay lip service to the requirements, without actually achieving the aims of the statutory instrument and the resulting Code of Practice, which surely must be to ensure that UK pension schemes are well governed and ultimately that members' pensions are protected. Predominantly, much of the Code of Practice is not actually new, and as auditors and advisors to pension schemes ourselves at RSM, we've always been interested in looking at scheme governance and providing support to trustees in ensuring that their schemes are well run. Our reports such as the Future of Pension Scheme Trusteeship, which we published in 2019, and our Mind the Expectation Gap report in 2020 which you can access still on our website. These are prime examples of our involvement here and our engagement with scheme governance, together with our award-winning governance matrix, which we've been sharing with clients for the last 5 years. However, whilst many schemes will already have implemented appropriately robust governance mechanisms, there are certainly areas of the new code that impose new requirements. For example, the new written policies in key areas, remuneration policies for those who run the scheme, for example, the appointment of advisors and providers, continuity and succession planning for trustees, advisors and providers, the identification and management of advisor conflicts, and finally, IT systems and cybersecurity. Whilst many trustee boards may have some of these in place already, they may be informal arrangements that are not formally written down anywhere, and there may also be many pension schemes who will not have any of these in place, and therefore trustees need to start thinking about these areas. One other change that the Combined Code introduces is the requirement for trustees to complete an own risk assessment, or ORA. Now, whilst the timescales for doing this may change as a result of the consultation process, the regulator has come out and said that they remain of the view that trustees should prepare their first ORA in a timely fashion, which means taking the legislative timescales as a maximum, but preparing the document in a shorter timescale as a matter of best practice. Trustees should therefore be thinking about their ORA because whatever changes are made as a result of the responses to the consultation document, the underlying legislation is quite clear in the requirements for the contents of the ORA. The statutory instrument mandates the carrying out and documentation of an own risk assessment of the system of governance by the trustees or managers of the scheme. This includes how the trustees or managers integrate the ORA into the scheme's management and decision-making processes, how the trustees or managers assess the effectiveness of the risk management system, how the trustees or managers prevent conflicts of interest with the employer, for example, where the occupational pension scheme outsources key functions to the same person as the employer does, or if they're outsourced to any person employed by the employer. How the trustees or managers assess the scheme's funding needs with reference to the recovery plan where applicable. How trustees or managers assess the risks to members and beneficiaries relating to the paying out of their benefits and the effectiveness of any remedial action, taking into account where applicable any indexation mechanisms, any benefit reduction mechanisms, which includes the extent to which any accrued pension benefits can be reduced, under what conditions and by whom. How trustees or managers assess the mechanisms protecting retirement benefits, including as applicable any guarantees or covenants or any other type of financial support by the employer, any insurance or reinsurance or coverage by a pension protection scheme. How the trustees or managers assess the operational risks of the scheme. And where ESG factors are considered in investment decisions, how trustees or managers are assessing any new or emerging risks, including risks relating to climate change, the use of resources and the environment, any social risks, and risks relating to the depreciation of assets, perhaps as a result of regulatory change. The timing of the ORA needs to be considered, particularly the timing for subsequent own risk assessments, which must be prepared at intervals of not more than 3 years. It's not yet clear what the ORA will look like in practice, and many of those who responded to the consultation have asked for additional guidance to be published in this area. But I think care must be taken to ensure that this is not simply a tick box exercise. Trustees must ensure that they are complying with the requirement to review the ESOG at least every 3 years or sooner if there is significant change to the governance or key risks facing the scheme. The final change I'd like to cover in this session is the introduction in the Combined Code of some new functions. The first of the new functions is the group to which responsibility is delegated for identifying, evaluating, monitoring and reporting on key risks and internal controls. This can either be a subcommittee or an independent body, but this will form the risk management function. The second is the internal audit function, which independently evaluates the adequacy and effectiveness of the system of governance. And it's important to note that the internal audit work has a much wider scope than the statutory audit, and will look at all sorts of processes and controls, not just those that impact upon the financial statements. In some cases, the internal audit function could be performed by the sponsors team if one exists, or it could be outsourced to a specialist provider or to an audit firm. All DB schemes will already have the actuarial function, as this is the scheme actuary role for DB schemes. The regulator has now said that it expects that the Code of Practice will be laid before Parliament in the spring of 2022 and will become effective from the summer of 2022. However, there is much that trustees can and should be doing now in preparation because, as I've demonstrated, the combined code will not change what is in the underlying legislation. In terms of steps that you could think about taking now, think about the 3 functions I've mentioned and the extent to which your scheme already has these in place and what work you might need to do if they don't already exist. If you need to establish a risk management function, you may decide that it's appropriate for this to be delegated away from the full board to a smaller group. If so, perhaps begin by considering the skill set of the existing board members and deciding whether it's appropriate to establish a risk management subcommittee from those people and inviting board members to join that committee. If it's felt that there aren't sufficient skills or the time available from the current board members, then start to think about how this can be outsourced instead. Whichever route is chosen, that group could perhaps then make a start by looking at the written policies that will need to be put in place. This may simply be checking that existing policies remain sufficient, or it may require a new policy. There are many schemes that don't have a remuneration policy, for example, which is an interesting comparison with governance requirements for charity trustees, for whom this has been a requirement for some time now. This group can also start looking at the ESOG and starting conversations with advisors. For example, beginning conversations with investment advisors about how ESG factors are brought into investment decisions, or the drawing up of contingency plans, for which many trustees will of course been tested over the last 18 months when COVID has thrown everything into disarray. In terms of the internal audit function, if the sponsoring employer already has an internal audit team, now would be the time to approach the employer to determine the extent to which the trustees can make use of that team and to begin to schedule in internal audit work that covers the pension scheme's operations. The challenge there will be that the internal audit programme can be often scheduled many months in advance, so this should not be left too late. There will also need to be agreements put in place to cover those arrangements, and the exact scoping will need to be agreed. Even if there is an employer internal audit team, there may not be enough resource in that team to cover the extra work that's going to be required for the pension scheme. So trustees will need to consider how else they might meet this requirement, either through a specialist internal audit provider or through an audit firm. DB schemes will already have the actuarial function in place, so there's no action to be taken there. But trustees will need to start thinking about how they are going to perform their first ORA and when that will be. Whilst further guidance is expected from the regulator, trustees at the very least should have the ORA on their board agenda, with early decisions being taken about who is going to be working on that, be it individual board members or if external assistance is going to be required for existing or new scheme advisors. Across our various service lines, we have extensive experience of working with trustees in various governance areas, approaching governance from an audit, covenant assessment and risk assessment perspective, and we're looking forward to working with our clients to help them to achieve compliance with the 2018 governance regulations. Ways in which we can help include risk workshops. This would either be in the form of providing licensed access to our bespoke risk management software tools to enable self-assessment and monitoring of scheme risks, or can take the form of a facilitated workshop during which we can help trustees to identify where their risks are and to think about whether or not there are or can be mitigating controls in place. We can also undertake risk maturity assessments, whereby we consider the risk appetite of the risk management function and the extent to which the attitude to risk management is fundamentally inbuilt into the everyday activities of the trustee board. Where trustees have completed a risk review exercise and have recorded a mitigating control in the risk register that reduces the assessed risk, perhaps from a red to a green risk, we can perform an assurance exercise over the controls in place and determine whether or not those mitigating controls in the risk register are actually operating effectively, such that their use to reduce the risk assessment within the risk register is actually appropriate. We can also perform cybersecurity and IT reviews. This includes looking at the wider data footprint to include scheme advisors and third parties and any cloud-based storage systems that are in use. Our internal controls reviews can use our experience of conducting AAF 0106 reports and SOC 1 audits to consider the suitability and operating effectiveness of the system of controls that's already in place. And our internal audit team can undertake reviews of all aspects of the scheme's operations, including non-financial areas. The work that would be completed would be under specific instructions from the trustees, and examples of previous work in this area include deep dives into benefit calculations and assessment of lifestyling matrices for DC arrangements, and closer examination of contributions looking at, for example, furloughed staff or maternity returners. Finally, our employer team can look at the risks pertaining to funding and the use of mechanisms such as guarantees and covenants from the employer. We can also draw upon our experience as the accreditation provider for PASA to support trustees as they navigate these new challenges. Please note that any assistance in this area from RSM is subject to conflict of interest checks, and under ethical standards applying to audit firms, if your scheme is already an external audit client, then we would not be able to provide assistance for those schemes that fall under the definition of an other entity of public interest. If you're unsure whether this definition applies to you, or if you would like to know any more about how RSM can help, then do please get in touch with me or speak to your regular RSM contact. Thank you for listening. I hope you have found this webinar useful, but please do not hesitate to get in touch with me or my RSM colleagues if you have any questions.